This afternoon, we are joined by Senator Tom Davis, incumbent senator from District 46 down in Beaufort and Jasper Counties. Senator Davis, thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Great to be with you, Patrick.
Well, we want to start by letting our members get to know you a little bit and a little bit of your background. So if you could, tell us a little bit about your personal and professional background and how that has shaped your thoughts on the importance of education in our state.
Sure. Okay. Well, I've been a resident of Beaufort County for 35 years. My wife, Reed, and I moved here in 1985, and I joined the law firm of Harvey and Batty in Beaufort, and I've been at the same firm for 35 years. We have three daughters. One daughter has graduated Clemson, and she's living up in Asheville. I've got my middle daughter, Grace, who's a junior at Clemson, and then my youngest daughter, Claire, is a sophomore at Beaufort High School. I practice real estate or transactional law. That's a fancy way of saying I don't get into court that much. I put together deals, I put together transactions, I help resolve problems. Very rarely do I litigate or get in before a judge, although I do that on occasion. Got involved in politics back in 2002 when my former friend, or current friend, but he became my friend at Furman back in, 1979. Mark Sanford ran for governor in 2002, and I had been doing his real estate and legal work for him here in Beaufort County because he owns property here. And he asked me if I would move to Charleston and move into his basement and run his gubernatorial campaign. And so I did. I took a 9-month leave of absence from my law practice and moved into his basement. He ended up winning the primary and then winning the general election that year. And I went back to my law practice. But then I saw him up in Columbia working on some of the things that we had talked about during the campaign and discovered that I'd been bitten by the bug and I wanted to get up there. So I took another leave of absence from my law practice, and this time became his senior policy advisor and then ultimately his chief of staff. Worked for him for 3 or 4 years and then ran for Senate in 2008. And here we are today.
Well, I will not let your daughters know that you had to do an interview with somebody with a Gamecock shirt on today.
No, and well, I finished up my law school career at USC, so okay. I pull for the Gamecocks when they play. So, well,
they need all the help they can get right now.
Yeah.
So obviously, a critically important issue to our members is the teaching workforce in South Carolina, and we're experiencing a crisis in this state of teachers leaving the profession and hundreds of vacancies in classrooms to start school years. So as a member of the General Assembly, what do you view as the key steps our state needs to take to better retain and to recruit top talent into our classrooms?
Well, I think it starts, and I realize this isn't the primary objective for teachers because I've talked to a lot of them, but it starts with salary. It starts with paying them a salary that's commensurate with their worth. And quite frankly, what we've done, Patrick, in regard to K through 12 education, particularly since the Abbeville decision, is we put more and more money into the K through 12 system, but relatively few or proportionally few of those dollars actually get into the classroom. And the reason for that is we've got multiple funding streams here for K through 12 in South Carolina. And each of those funding streams has bureaucrats or people associated with it to make sure that X's are made here and I's dotted here and T's crossed there. And so much of that money that we appropriate gets soaked up in that bureaucratic administrative process. And so what I have long advocated and what I think needs to happen is collapsing those funding streams into a single funding stream or maybe one or two. Keep your weighting factors in there to make sure that you get an equitable allocation of money to areas that don't have a high property tax base, or if they have a higher proportion of individuals who qualify for free or reduced lunch. I understand we need to have weighting factors, but to have, dozens of different funding formulas and then state employees associated with each one soaks up too much of that money. So I think the first thing we need to do is simplify that funding structure so that more dollars gets into the classroom to things that really matter: teacher salaries, curriculum, instructional materials, things of that nature. So I would start with funding reform. Second to that, though, would be something that I worked on this spring, as you know, with Mike Fanning. It's called the Teacher Bill of Rights. That's a fancy way of saying that the teacher in the classroom should be sovereign. The teacher in that classroom ought to be somebody whose judgment is respected, whose professional expertise is respected, who doesn't feel like they always have administrators looking over their shoulders, isn't continually saddled up with more, filing and technical requirements, reporting requirements, because, that destroys the quality of life. You guys want to teach. I mean, most people, my daughter is studying right now at Clemson to become a teacher. She wants to teach. And so two things: simplify the funding stream so that more dollars gets into the classroom and we can get teacher salaries up to the national average. I think that ought to be at least our target. And then second of all, making sure the teacher is sovereign in that classroom and implementing something along the lines of a teacher bill of rights. What I proposed is that it be actionable, that teachers have the right to enforce those rights, so that if a district or a superintendent or a principal wasn't honoring these things, these 9 or 10 things that we've outlined, that there'd be recourse. And what we had to settle for, unfortunately, was just a statement of public policy that we think these are good things that teachers ought to have. I think we ought to focus in on making those actionable rights that teachers can enforce in the event that administrators infringe upon them.
So you covered a lot of ground there that was addressed in S419, the reform bill that made it through the Senate. And I would be remiss if I didn't note that you worked closely with PSTA and reached out to teachers across your district to inform yourself before that legislation came to the floor. So since it didn't pass the House, that issue is likely to come up again in the next term. So projecting forward to 2021, what do you think the direction the General Assembly needs to take on the topic of education reform is? Obviously supporting that Bill of Rights provision that was Section 9 of S419, but what else do you see as the top priorities?
Well, I think you need to break them down into smaller bills, quite frankly. Anytime you get a comprehensive bill like that, you end up making compromises along the way and end up with a half loaf at best. And so I think in terms of priority, what you focus on is making sure not only do you get your step increase retroactive, the one that you missed this year and the one for next year, that we go ahead and follow through on what Governor McMaster said in the State of the State, which was, okay, last year we took care of new hires, first-time teachers, trying to make sure there was a baseline. Go ahead and give that 5% across the board salary increase and commit ourselves to a future course of action to bring us up to the national average. I mean, that has got to be the number one thing that we do. We can do other things as well. I mean, in terms of the Teacher Bill of Rights, what people need to understand, and your members do understand, this is all centered around one thing. That teacher in that classroom is sovereign. That teacher's opinion is respected. And I can understand the thing that I heard from my teachers, and of course they wanted to be paid a wage commensurate with their skills, but their biggest complaint was they felt like administration didn't have their back, or they felt like anytime a parent came forward that they were on the defensive and that they didn't have somebody that was going to stand up for them. That's got to change. And I don't want to be that guy, that says, get off my lawn and shakes my fist. But I can remember when I was in grade school, that teacher in that classroom was the king or the queen. And you did not contradict what that teacher said, because you were going to get your butt kicked by your parents if you disobeyed that teacher. And that, for some reason, somehow that's eroded over time. And the sense that kids can act up and speak out and that there's not going to be consequences, that's something that has to change. Because if you don't, I mean, we can raise the salary and make it commensurate with the national average, and we ought to do that. But if you don't make things better in that classroom, if you don't improve the quality of life for that teacher and let that teacher do what they want to do, which is teach kids, you're not going to get the quality of people you need.
Well, it sounds like your parents and my parents went to the same school of parenting. You mentioned Governor McMaster and his push for continued increased pay for teachers. He's also likely in the State of the State next spring to mention another topic, which is school vouchers or school choice programs, similar to the Safe Grants program that he's created out of federal relief dollars. Because he said that he wants the General Assembly to create something similar on a recurring basis out of state dollars. So as a member of the General Assembly, if that request comes from the governor or if legislation is introduced in the Senate, what's your position on the topic of choice and vouchers or private school scholarships from public funds?
I think our first job has to be to take care of the teachers in the classroom right now, in terms of the salaries, in terms of keeping promises that were made, and making sure that those salaries get up to national average. Second of all, in regard to school choice, I have long been an advocate, along with several prominent Democratic senators, for the Exceptional Needs Scholarship Program. I honestly think that in certain instances, families can get a better result if their child who has special needs goes to a school or goes to an institution that focuses exclusively on special needs. And I think that program works. I'd like to see that program get set on a firm footing because I think we can learn lessons from it. So in terms of priorities for me, it's going to be focusing on getting more paid to teachers, classroom teachers in our K through 12 system, trying to give them more sovereignty. I use that word sovereignty in the classroom, so that respect flows from that. And then trying to get the exceptional needs scholarship programs up and running and functioning well. If that functions well, then we can have a larger conversation about where we go from there.
You mentioned earlier the multiple streams of funding in our schools and the need to consolidate down to one. And obviously that's tied heavily to equity because of different
Right.
tax bases and revenue streams for different counties across the state. As a member of the General Assembly, obviously funding formula reform is a big part of equity. That's why the study group was formed last fall to look at that. But what else in your mind can the state do to enhance equity so that a child gets an excellent education regardless of where they live in the state of South Carolina?
Well, I think maybe you add to some of the weighting factors that currently exist under the Education Finance Act. As you know, there are certain weighting factors that direct those dollars to certain districts that have, greater needs than others. And when I talk about funding reform, what we need to understand, Patrick, is the benchmark funding, the Education Finance Act passed in 1977, really doesn't make any sense anymore, because the way it was set up is, if you're a county with a high assessed property tax base, if you've got a lot of real property, a lot of value, you have a high index of tax paying ability, because the assumption is you can go ahead and tax yourself and pay for schools, so you don't really need state dollars. That doesn't really make any sense anymore, because with Act 388, you took away local government's ability to tax 4% residential properties to pay for school operating costs. So on the one hand, you look at the assessed tax base and you give a county a high index of tax paying ability and they don't get much base student cost money. But on the other hand, through Act 388, you're saying, well, you can't tax those properties. So it is just structurally is obsolete. And what we need to do, not only from the standpoint of reducing the administrative burden and soaking up of the dollars that ought to be going into the classroom, it ought to be collapsed, because that gives you a better way to do equity. At that point in time, you don't have to worry about dozens of funding streams. You can look at one or two funding streams and apply to it the weighting factors that you think are appropriate, and you can be much more precise in the results.
We've covered a lot of ground on educational topics, but I want to make sure that our members learn about you, especially the things you want to make sure that they know prior to November. So is there anything we haven't covered that you absolutely want to make sure our members know before they vote?
Yeah, in terms of education, and rightly so, we put a lot of emphasis on STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. But I'm concerned about the corresponding less emphasis placed on civics and understanding of our institution and the founding of the country and, from 1619 through the current day. What are the things that made us what we are today? What are our governing documents? What does the Constitution mean? And these things are critical, because if you don't have that bedrock civic education, and if people don't understand that about their country, they're going to be prone to making decisions based on emotion. And whether you're talking about the right or the left, they're going to be swept up by emotional arguments instead of saying, well, wait a minute, let's ask ourselves, what does the 14th Amendment say here with due process of law or equal protections of the law? Or what do the Bill of Rights, how do they play into this, and how does it constrain what Congress can do? Having that sort of bedrock civic understanding is every bit as important as STEM education. And I'm not denigrating science, technology, engineering, math. I get it. But I see ourselves moving in a direction to where civics is being left behind, and they're not becoming the sort of functioning, effective citizens that we're going to need them to be in the years ahead. So I would like to see more emphasis placed on that, a more rounded liberal arts kind of an education, instead of just focusing in on technical exclusively. I'm saying still do it, but just don't do it exclusively.
Well, as a U.S. government teacher who assigned his students a Supreme Court opinion to read this weekend dealing with the 14th Amendment, I can't think of a better way to go into the weekend than that statement. So Senator Davis, thank you for sharing with us and with our members. And thank you for your service to our state. We wish you all the best.
Let me say this. We didn't get it done this year. The Senate tried to, but I made a commitment to you. I made a commitment to Ms. Manis in your organization and to the teachers in my district that the number one priority when we go back into Columbia and we look at that recurring revenue and we look at the dollars that we have to spend, we need to keep those promises to the teachers, not just in 1 year, but to put us on a path to get it to that national average, because You only get what you pay for. And if you want to get high quality teachers in that classroom, you got to pay them a salary commensurate with their abilities. And I am committed to doing that.
Well, I know that that is something that our members will be very grateful to hear, and we appreciate you continuing to fight for that support for teachers from our state.
Patrick, I appreciate you having me. Have a great weekend.
Yes, sir. You too.
All right, take care.